Question 17 asks you to describe in detail how G proteins work. Include the roles played by GEFs and GAPs in the process. For some G proteins, actually we'll get to that part later because that's kind of a second question there. All right, well, how does a G protein work? All right, G proteins, they basically have two states. They have a state where there's GTP bound. So this is our G protein here with G protein with GTP bound, and there's a state with GDP bound. All right, the way that these work is the GDP bound state I like to think of as off. The GTP bound state I like to think of as on. Right, whatever the function of this G protein is generally turned on by GTP binding, turned off when GDP is bound. Now the way that GTP gets bound is the GDP falls out and a new GTP comes in to bind. Right? So we're doing an exchange process to go from the GDP to the GTP bound state. So we're exchanging the nucleotide that's in there. This process is accelerated by proteins called GEFs, which stands for guanine exchange factor. So these are basically proteins that will accelerate that exchange process. Now to go from the on state to the off state, what is happening here is a hydrolysis reaction. So the GTP is getting hydrolyzed to form GDP and a phosphate, and then the phosphate just leaves. Right. So the proteins that accelerate this process are called GAPs. These are GTPase accelerating proteins. Right, so GAPs will accelerate the hydrolysis. GEFs will accelerate the exchange process. So in a nutshell, that's how G proteins work. Now, the second question here, for some G proteins, GTP binding causes the protein to localize to the cell membrane. How does this work? Well, in this case, the on state of the G protein is basically binding to the membrane. Now, the way this usually works for these particular G proteins is that these are lipid-linked proteins. So they might have a farnesyl group, for instance, or maybe a covalently bound fatty acid or something like that in the protein. But basically, in the off state, whatever that lipid molecule is, it is packed in, basically tucked inside of the protein. Right? So it's inaccessible to the membrane. But in the on state, the protein basically undergoes a conformational change, and that lipid portion is now exposed on the exterior of the protein and will go insert itself into the lipid membrane. And so this is how GTP binding can cause the protein to localize to the cell membrane.